I know I have the body, but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England, too. That right there, absolutely one of the most charismatic quotes in all of English history. She uttered it to her troops at Tilbury back in 1588, right as they were staring down a massive Spanish invasion. And honestly, it's a literal masterclass in rhetoric. But, it also perfectly sets up this brilliant tension that defined her entire reign. I'm talking about the massive gap between the grand illusion she projected and the incredibly harsh realities she was actually facing behind the scenes. Welcome back, focused learners, to this explainer. Today, our goal is to completely demystify Elizabeth I. For centuries now, her legacy has been wrapped up in this inflated, almost Victorian romanticism. You know the vibe, the ageless, untouchable virgin queen presiding over a flawless golden era of English history. Well, today we're stripping all of that away. By really digging into the historical record, we're going to reveal a deeply pragmatic, incredibly cautious survivor, someone who literally used her public image as a shield in a highly volatile world. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First up, surviving the Tudor court. Then, we'll look at the Virgin Queen persona, battling rivals, rebellions, and armadas, the late-stage illusion of Gloriana, and finally, separating the myth from the historical reality. All right, Section 1, Surviving the Tudor Court. To really get inside Elizabeth's head as a monarch, we can't start with her supreme power. We actually have to start with a childhood defined by razor-thin margins of pure survival. Think about this. By the time she was just 2 years and 8 months old, her mother, Anne Boleyn, was beheaded on the orders of her own father, Henry VIII. Boom. Elizabeth is instantly declared illegitimate and tossed straight out of the succession. Fast forward a bit to 1553, and she's riding triumphantly into London alongside her Catholic half-sister, Queen Mary. But man, that solidarity evaporates so fast. The very next year, suspected of backing Protestant rebels during Wyatt's rebellion, Elizabeth gets thrown straight into the Tower of London. For nearly a year, under intense interrogation and house arrest, she is literally one misstep away from the executioner's block, before miraculously surviving to take the throne in 1558. So the crucial point is how much this early trauma profoundly shaped her approach to power. It hardwired into her a lifelong instinct for extreme caution, total neutrality, and absolute emotional control. In fact, her famous personal motto became "Video et taceo," which translates to "I see and keep silent." She figured out really early on that committing to a side or, actually revealing your true thoughts, that was a fantastic way to lose your head. And this philosophy of strategic silence ended up being the defining hallmark of her entire 44-year reign. Let's move to Section 2, the Virgin Queen persona. Okay, so she takes the throne at age 25 and instantly hits her first massive test. The absolute most pressing expectation from her government and parliament was that she needed to get married and produce an heir to lock down the succession. But Elizabeth totally flipped the script on them. She saw the intense political risks of tying the knot. If she married a foreign prince, like her sister Mary had done with Philip of Spain, she risked getting dragged into foreign wars and essentially handing over her own authority. But if she married an English nobleman, well, that's just a recipe for jealousy, massive factionalism, and domestic rebellion. So by staying single, she retained absolute power for herself. Plus, she completely avoided those entanglements and brilliantly used her availability as this endless diplomatic bait. She kept foreign royals on the hook for decades just to maintain the balance of power in Europe, all without ever actually committing. What started out as a clever, diplomatic stalling tactic eventually morphed into literally one of history's greatest PR campaigns, the cult of virginity. As she aged, court poetry and these highly controlled portraits started comparing her to the Virgin Mary, depicting her as this divine, completely untouchable goddess. Ultimately, she just flat out insisted she was already married to her kingdom and her subjects. And you've got to understand, this wasn't just vanity. It was a brilliantly constructed political force field that elevated her way above normal human expectations and vulnerabilities. All right, Section 3. Rivals, rebellions, and armadas. Now, a brilliant PR campaign is great, but it wasn't going to stop the very real physical threats to her throne. Her whole reign was just a relentless barrage of domestic and foreign challenges, all deeply tangled up in the intense religious and political divides of 16th century Europe. The most persistent internal threat? That came from her own cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Objectively speaking, Mary actually possessed a very strong, highly legitimate claim to the English throne. Because of that, she naturally acted as a focal point for English Catholics who wanted to see her replace Elizabeth. It was a complex dynamic that sparked a major northern rebellion, and then in 1570, the Pope officially excommunicated Elizabeth, theoretically releasing Catholic subjects from any loyalty to her. Mary ended up imprisoned in England for nearly 2 decades, constantly at the center of various plots, until it all culminated in her execution in 1587. It was a drastic move that Elizabeth agonized over and delayed for ages, but eventually sanctioned just to ensure her own survival. Naturally, Mary's execution completely enraged Catholic Europe, and specifically King Philip II of Spain. Let's move to and see how this builds into the most famous military event of her reign, the 1588 Spanish Armada. When this massive Spanish invasion fleet shows up in the Channel, the English Navy tactically unleashes burning fire ships at midnight off Gravelanes. This completely shatters the Spanish formation, scattering them to the northeast. And then the fleeing, disorganized fleet got catastrophically wrecked by severe storms off the coast of Ireland. It was this massive defensive victory and, frankly, an unparalleled propaganda triumph for Protestant England. Everyone took it as a literal sign of divine favor. But wait, here is exactly where the popular myth shatters against historical reality. 11,000 to 15,000 dead or wounded. But that didn't happen to the Spanish. That happened to the English. Literally just 1 year after defeating the Spanish Armada, Elizabeth greenlit the English counter-armada of 1589 to go attack Spain. And it was a total disaster, a completely disjointed, catastrophic failure that ended in massive casualties and the loss of 40 ships. The huge advantage England had just won was instantly squandered. It really proves that this idea of total English naval dominance during this era is largely just a myth. Moving on to Section 4. The illusion of Gloria. This brings us to the final decade of her rule, the 1590s. And man, this era felt fundamentally different from those earlier, more stable years. It was incredibly grim. We're talking severe economic hardship, terrible harvests, and bitter factional infighting at court. It was a massive contrast to that golden illusion she was still projecting. A huge driver of this domestic tension was actually economic. See, she really didn't want to keep asking Parliament to fund her long, expensive wars. So she leaned heavily on a system known as the patent of monopoly. Basically, this was a royal grant that gave certain favored courtiers exclusive control over a specific trade or manufactured good. And predictably, it led to massive price fixing. It enriched a tiny handful of favorites at the absolute expense of the general public. By 1601, this sparked widespread resentment and completely unprecedented agitation against her in the House of Commons. Now, what's really interesting about all this is the incredibly stark, honestly kind of uncomfortable contrast between her cultivated image and the actual reality at this point. The PR machine was running hot, pumping out literature like Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen, portraying her as Gloriana or Belphoebe, this eternally youthful, universally beloved figure, bringing about a golden age. But the 1590s reality? Completely different story. Elizabeth was visibly aging. She was hiding deep scars from a 1562 bout of smallpox under layers of heavy lead makeup. She relied entirely on wigs, and she suffered from tooth decay that was so severe, foreign ambassadors literally couldn't understand what she was saying when she spoke. And all the while, the country itself was just groaning under heavy taxes, crazy inflation, and these seemingly endless wars. And the absolute most draining of those conflicts was the 9 Years' War in Ireland. The historical reality of this war was just brutal. English crown forces used scorched earth tactics, intentionally burning land to deny the rebels any resources. This led to horrifying mass starvation. We're talking an estimated 30,000 Irish people starved to death in the province of Munster alone. It's incredibly dark. Plus, the financial drain of fighting this brutal war pushed England right to the very brink of bankruptcy. The rebels, who had the backing of Spain, were ultimately defeated, but get this, the final surrender didn't actually happen until 1603, literally just days after Elizabeth herself had died. Which leads us to our final section, Section 5, Myth versus Historical Reality. So how do we actually evaluate her 44 years on the throne once we strip away all that inflated Victorian romanticism? Well, on one hand, you've got these contemporary critiques, like from the explorer Walter Raleigh. He famously complained, Her Majesty did all by halves. And he wasn't alone. Tons of military commanders were incredibly frustrated by her extreme caution, her refusal to fully fund foreign expeditions, and her endless second-guessing. But here is why this really matters. When you look at the incredibly short, disastrous, and often bloody reigns of her half-siblings who came before her, Elizabeth provided 44 years of much-needed, welcome stability. She established an English church that still survives today, and in doing so, she really helped forge a unified national identity. That incredibly frustrating caution that Raleigh hated, that is exactly what kept the country intact.
So it leaves us with this final thought to consider. Was Elizabeth I's legendary success the result of some brilliant, deliberate, grand strategy? Was it purely the product of masterful PR and illusion masking a really ramshackle government? Or, as a lot of modern historians suggest, was she simply incredibly lucky to survive in an era when neighboring monarchs were constantly being deposed by civil wars? The truth is, it's likely a fascinating, messy mix of all three. Keep questioning the myths of history, focused learners. Until next time.